When we think of Alfred Hitchcock, I think we tend to think of the big, successful American movies he made later in his career. Films like Rear Window, Vertigo, The Birds, and, of course, Psycho. But in actual fact, this son of a greengrocer was born and raised here in Leytonstone, in the East End of London, which, coincidentally, is where I spent all of my childhood. He spent the first 40 years of his life living and working and making movies here in London. So I wanted to find out just to what extent this Hollywood legend, this master of cinema, the most famous, successful director in the history of movies, is actually made in Britain.
How do you do? I'm Alfred Hitchcock.
Alfred Hitchcock is pretty much unique in cinema history in that his career began in the era of silent films. He consolidated his work during the early talkies and then really went on to create masterpieces during the golden age of Hollywood. Even today, his influence, his style, his ideas can be found everywhere. Thanks to him, everyone knows what vertigo means.
Vertigo, a feeling of dizziness, a swimming in the head.
And because of him, birds have a terrible reputation.
They're coming! They're coming!
I deal in nightmares.
Although his films were always designed to be popular with a broad audience, there was a darkness to them that I've always found fascinating. Beneath the surface, he was always interested in the stranger, more sinister side of life.
The best thing about Hitchcock is probably how much he hates the police, which is what I look for in any filmmaker.
Hitchcock stands out as one of the most successful film directors of all time, and his big personality is almost as famous as his movies.
Bum, 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 bum.
In total, he made 53 feature films, but 23 of those were made before he went to America. So I'd like to take a look at those movies and at Hitchcock's life in Britain to see where it all started.
The French say the early English period is quite different from the American period.
And where better to start than my and Alfred's old tube station? I used to walk down this underpass every day on the way to school for about, 12 years. And it was a long walk, and it didn't look anything like this, really, back then. I mean, it was the same, but it had posters everywhere, none of the mosaics. And I don't think that was exposed, but that was the big department store here. There was a sort of fancy one that you go to for, like, big Christmas presents or when you wanted to buy furniture or something like that. We didn't get a lot of stuff from there, but it was the big destination place. It was an incredible building, and I bet that was there when Hitchcock lived there. I bet that was their turn of the century, because they knocked it down in the, I think, late 60s. But it's great to see that sign again. It's great to be back here. It's really exciting. Leytonstone has commemorated its most famous son in a series of mosaics. Walking down here gives just a hint of what this local hero achieved. Beautiful, isn't it? Look at that. Really nice. To make over 50 films in a career is a feat that not many other directors have even come close to. They've obviously chosen well. They've chosen the kind of key moments which not necessarily even happen in the movie. They did, of course, but moments which kind of sum up the film. That is the essence of Birds, right there. Go on, look at this. We've got a bit of tissue, so I want to get rid of this blob of chewing gum on his nose. That's very disrespectful. On Vertigo, that's Jimmy Stewart. You can't leave a bit of chewing gum there. You get that? Yeah, it's better. Can't put a bit of chewing gum on James Stewart's nose. Leytonstone Ute, eh? The only real difference, apart from the mosaics down here from when I used to walk this way to school, was the fact there used to be movie posters all the way down here. It used to be really exciting. On the days when they replaced the posters, that was how we'd know what was coming up. We wouldn't know until we saw that, and it was so exciting. But look at this one. This one is The Skin Game from 1932. So these are the kind of movies that I want to find out about, because these are the films that actually formed the foundation of Hitchcock's career when he was living, working, making his movies here in London. And these were hits, so many of these were hits. That's what, helped him become the master. And that's what I think people have forgotten about, which is a shame. With so many films to choose from, it's hard to know where to start. But first, I want to know what led an East End grocer's son into the fledgling film industry in the first place.
I suppose it must have all started when I was in my mother's arms at the age of 6 months. And she said to me, "Boo."
Leytonstone High Road, 1899, where Alfred Hitchcock was born above his father's greengrocer's shop.
Boo!
Hitchcock's childhood was part of his legend. Whenever he talked about his time in the East End, he'd always cite experiences from his youth, which he felt explained how his outlook developed. He described an encounter with a grotesque auntie in his cot as being one of the most horrible experiences of his life. I remember the first time I became aware of Alfred Hitchcock. It's when Psycho was going to be shown on TV when I was a kid, and that's the house I lived in all my childhood. That was my bedroom upstairs. I shared it with 4 brothers. Downstairs below was the room we had the television in, and we were told we couldn't see this movie. It was too scary for children of our age. I decided that I knew better, so that night, when my parents were asleep, my brothers were asleep, I crept out of bed, crept downstairs and watched it on my own, in the dark, so I didn't want anyone to know I was up, on our black and white television. Scared the life out of me. I'd like to say now very publicly to my parents, you were both right, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that, but part of me is glad I did.
Fear was a big part of Hitchcock's life and kind of early development. He loved to tell the most famous story, which he repeated over and over again to the extent that people question whether or not it really happened.
You've given a lot of audiences shocks sitting in the stalls. You've frightened me to death with Psycho. What frightens you?
Policeman.
His father gave him a note and told him to take it to the local police station. The young Hitchcock did this and was promptly locked in a cell for a few minutes or for longer, depending on who he was telling the story to. The policeman let him out and said, "This is what we do to naughty boys."
And that's why I won't drive a car. If I don't drive a car, I can't get a ticket. Can't bear the suspense. I'm really quite distressed about it.
Hitchcock was perhaps the first director to become a celebrity in his own right, and as such he gave hundreds of interviews, often repeating the same stories from his childhood. And although I always enjoy hearing them, I've come to the conclusion that maybe some of them should be taken with a pinch of salt.
All of the stories he told were exactly what the journalists wanted to hear. They're all terribly convenient. They're all terribly well constructed. So they're part of a kind of narrative that absolutely fits the persona that he's invented for himself.
If there is a pinch of salt to be taken with the stories from his early childhood, there's no doubt that adolescence was tricky for young Alfred.
1914 was the beginning of the First World War. It was also the year in which he got his first job at the Henley Telegraph Company in the summer of 1914. Soon after that, his father died, which must have had a profound effect on the young Hitchcock. Hitchcock also attributed the First World War as giving him his first real experience of true fear. We often think about the Blitz and the terror of bombing over London, but during the First World War, London was being bombed, and this was an entirely new and shocking experience for the population. Hitchcock painted very vivid pictures of what happened during some of these bombing raids. He talked about his mother cowering under the kitchen table.
Young Alfred found refuge in books and theatre, as well, of course, as the latest form of entertainment, cinema.
As a child, I was a great first-nighter, to the theatre. Used to go alone, and also to the movies.
It was obvious that what really interested the young Hitch was storytelling.
He really liked the middle-brow popular fiction of the period. Authors like John Buchan, who wrote The 39 Steps, Arthur Conan Doyle, Mrs. Belloc Lowndes, who wrote a novel called The Lodger that would be very important in Hitchcock's career.
It was clear that even as a young man, Hitchcock knew he wanted to work in the film industry. I'm standing on the side of what was once the famous Players Lasky movie studios that became the Gainsborough Studios. And Hitchcock got his first job working for them at 20, designing the intertitles that appeared on screen with the silent movies. The same silent movies that he would be directing in just 5 short years.
He ends up as an assistant director to one of the big directors that they have employed there, a man called Graham Cutts. And he becomes, in a way, the secret power behind Graham Cutts' throne. Graham Cutts is a kind of womanising, erratic figure. And he begins to rely upon Hitchcock. And so slowly the servant becomes the master.
According to legend, you became a director because the director who you'd been assisting would no longer work with you. Is that a fair way of describing the situation?
I don't think he'd no longer work with me. He didn't want me to work with him.
That in some ways you were breaking into his territory?
Oh, I not only broke into his territory, I gave him the shots and where they should be taken. I built the set in such a way you couldn't take it from any other angle.
There were, of course, many people that Hitchcock worked with time and again. Actors, cinematographers, composers, but there was only one true constant in his career, his wife, Alma. He married Alma Revel in 1926, and she became his closest collaborator, credited with working with him on 22 movies and informally assisting him on many more.
Hitchcock was a big star director, really from the very early years. He would have been surrounded by people who wouldn't have dared tell him what the truth really was. And she was the only person who was honest with him.
Hitch and Alma settled down to married life in Kensington with a weekend retreat in Surrey. And in 1928, their much-adored daughter Pat was born, to give Hitch a happy home life to add to the burgeoning film career. His first film as a director was The Pleasure Garden. Even there you can see the classic Hitchcock themes emerging: voyeurism, betrayal and, of course, murder. But it didn't take long for Hitchcock to deliver a film which is almost the blueprint for what would become the classic Hitchcock movie. Hitch's third picture, The Lodger, was considered even at the time to be a masterpiece of British filmmaking and established Hitchcock as the top British director at the age of just 28. The Lodger is a Jack the Ripper-like story about a killer who is lurking in a sinister and foggy London, murdering curly-headed blondes. The Lodger himself is played by Ivan Novello, a musical idol and heartthrob of the time. He lodges with the family in a house at the heart of where the murders are happening, and the strange character is very quickly suspected of being the killer. Hitch hints at his guilt throughout the film, but The Lodger is our first example of a favourite kind of Hitchcock character, a man wrongly accused.
There are all kinds of ideas in The Lodger that Hitchcock would return to time and time again. There is the blonde in peril. There is the figure of the accused man, the man who may or may not be guilty, but who is certainly living in a guilty kind of way. And you also get that interest in the moment of murder.
Inevitably, when you watch a film like The Lodger today, some of it seems a little stagey, but even now you can sense how innovative and how bold it must have seemed to that audience. I really get the feeling that this was a modern filmmaker working at the very cutting edge of what was possible in cinema. It's also our chance to see the first of Hitchcock's legendary cameos, even if it is just the back of the great man's head.
Incidentally, when I had finished The Lodger, and it was seen by the distributors, we thought it was so bad that it shouldn't be shown. Stayed on the shelf for about 2 or 3 months. And they said, well, we have an investment in this. Better take a look at it again. And they finally agreed to show it. And then it was acquired as the greatest British film made to that period.
The Lodger's box office success marked Alfred Hitchcock as the British director to watch. And of course, it was just the beginning. I've lived in London all my life, and one of the exciting things about driving around London isn't just being in the heart of one of the most exciting and iconic cities in the world, but it's going past locations, buildings, places which I recognise from some of my favourite movies of all time. And of course, that includes a lot of Hitchcock's movies. And of course, like any director, a lot of his movies are shot inside studios and on sound stages. But if you're living and working in a city as exciting and vibrant as this, and of course, if you're setting your films here, then you would have been crazy not to make the most of the incredible locations and the excitement that you get, and I feel, watching those early movies on screen and seeing not just the beauty of London, but the beauty of London as it was and as it no longer is. It really adds an extra something. These are the buildings where the murders take place, of course. These are the streets that the killers walked, where they were chased, those long, tense chase sequences.
I've been making up my mind to find a place that I used to know.
You've got the buses, one of which very famously has that long sequence where the little boy is carrying the can of film that holds a bomb in it. I don't want to spoil it for anyone, no spoilers, but it does go off. Piccadilly Circus that we're driving through today is virtually unrecognisable when you look at the Piccadilly Circus that's used as a backdrop for that key scene in Blackmail when the young woman's walking home after murdering the man who attempted to have his way with her forcefully. And there's a shot of the neon flashing, which must have been such an incredible thing back then. I mean, it's still exciting for tourists to visit now. And Hitchcock does something which must have been so bold for the time. You see the flashing of a cocktail shaker, a drink being poured, and then he dissolves and mixes through to a knife being stabbed down into the victim we've just seen. And that's obviously the woman's troubled, guilt-ridden thoughts coming out. Well, he obviously had a love of the city and a love of this place as being such an iconic backdrop that people all over the world wanted to see on screen. He used it brilliantly.
At the age of just 28, Hitch was firmly in the driving seat as a director.
It's as if Hitchcock used the British film industry as his own personal film school. The 10 silent films he made over the next 10 years allowed him to develop and refine his technique, the technique that he would eventually take to Hollywood.
In Hitchcock's hands, the camera gained a new life. Its movement and its ever-changing perspective brought a whole new way of seeing things to his films. He exposed his audience to the full potential of the new medium. To Hitch, cinema was always so much more than just a way to record theatre.
Hitchcock absorbed a lot of influences from European cinema, particularly Russian and German cinema. He went to Berlin. He immersed himself in those expressionist techniques.
He was obsessed with cinema. He thought cinematically. He lived, breathed and slept cinema. And he was very keen to always insert these incredible Hitchcock touches into his films, very clever visual tricks that the press would pick up on and talk about. And this really helped raise his status and profile amongst British directors of the time.
The language of the camera is the same as the language of the writer.
He called it pure cinema, unleashing the camera's full potential to tell the story and manipulate the audience's emotions. And no one did it better than Hitch.
I wanted a director's perspective on Hitch, so I sought out fellow Hitchcock fan Richard Ayoade.
Richard, take a seat. I've got popcorn in case we fancy it.
Great, thanks.
But thank you so much for finding some time to talk to me, because I'm admiring you as a filmmaker now that you're directing.
You're very kind and wrong.
And I know that you are a fan of Hitchcock, like I am.
Yeah, no, I am, yes.
If you had to sum up, what are the things about Hitchcock's work or Hitchcock's style or Hitchcock's talent that you most admire or that strike you as being Hitchcockian?
I can't think of many other directors who are just as memorable as him in terms of the number of sequences from films and camera movement and how inventive he was. Also, he's one of the most entertaining filmmakers there's ever been. What I love so much about it is the subjectivity, and he was amazing at subjective camera work, and his idea of pure cinema, it was essentially you show something, you show someone watch it, you show it, you see their reaction. He's kind of the best director to learn from in terms of how to make films, in that he really is a masterclass in the grammar of filmmaking.
One of the things I love about Hitchcock's early movies are the playfulness and inventiveness he brings to them. And nowhere is that more apparent than his use of special effects, using techniques which were very much in their infancy back then. I'm going to talk to a modern special effects supervisor, Mike Tucker, to tell me exactly how Hitchcock did what he did back then. Hello, Mike.
Hello there.
Nice to meet you. I'm hoping you're a Hitchcock fan.
Oh, indeed, indeed.
Thank God for that. OK, so tell me about some of the early techniques that he used, because I think you're normally aware of them when they're happening, which maybe wasn't the intention, but I guess it was because they were new.
Back then, they don't have the option of post-production the way that we take it for granted these days. You know, there was no green screens, there's no blue screens. So if you're doing something that's a big set, or you want to put people into a set, you have to do it in camera. And it means using an awful lot of mirrors. And this is a classic mirror technique called the Schuften process.
The Schuften?
And what they're doing here is you place the mirror at 45 degrees to the camera. So you're reflecting your model.
So the camera is seeing the mirror, which is seeing that.
But what you've done is, in a predetermined position, you've scraped the silvering off the back of the mirror, so that what you're left with is just the clear glass.
I see, so that's got an angle at the bottom because the doorway's supposedly at an angle.
That's right.
So you've actually made it harder for yourself.
Yeah.
So we have the model there.
So a model set, which is then being reflected in this mirror. And it's seeing through to a background which you can put live action in.
So this set we can do anything we want with, and obviously I guess the advantage would be, A, location-wise you're doing it in the studio, you said, but also it would cost you a fortune.
If you replace the model with the projection screen and project onto that screen previously shot live action, you can now combine actors into stuff that had been shot before.
A crowd scene, if you wanted that, or an action sequence.
Or an action sequence that you wanted to put an actor in because it was too dangerous to have him there on the day.
I don't know whether Hitchcock, like many great directors, was actually that bothered about the safety of his actors, frankly. I think maybe it was just a cost thing. How kind of widely used was it at the time when Hitchcock was using it? I know he used it in Blackmail, very early in the history of cinema. It's 1929, and he used it particularly, I think there's a sequence when he went into the British Museum, and as I understand it, he didn't have permission to shoot in the British Museum.
Yes.
So he faked it with this kind of thing.
That's right, and again, it's the big statue that's been reflected into that shot.
How surprising would this have been for an audience to know this was going on, do you think, back then? Because I think now, even if we don't know exactly how it's done, we're very, very aware of special effects.
I think it's the magician's art back then. People must have been going into cinemas and coming out and going, how on earth did they get that shot? And I think that's lovely.
So we've got the mirror in place in exactly the right spot.
Yep.
There's the model. So I'm going to ask you to go round so I can see it, Mike. So you go there. This could be your big break in movies, Mike. You know that, don't you?
I know that.
Yeah, OK, stop there. And I'm going to cue you in. No, what? I didn't say go yet.
Back we go.
Actors. OK, you ready?
Yeah.
OK. That isn't a cue, by the way. OK. And action. And then come towards me. You're very, very sad.
And the effect will probably be blown by that
now you're too big.
Yeah.
And you're still behind the door.
So that's it. So there's an
that
optimum
only
position.
Really worked there. I see.
There's an optimum position where the scale of the actor is now in scale proportionally with the model.
Yeah, exactly. So the statue looks bigger than you, but you walk forward, of course, we're losing that shot. And that's incredible. So you really see how it's working. Next time I go on holiday, I might take this kind of stuff with me, just so I can put the kids in a different location.
Exactly.
Or just don't take them on holiday with me. Take the photographs at home, lock them in the room, crack the window, so they're there, go on my own. OK, you may go now. And if I were you, I'd start working on your award acceptance speech, because that was exceptional. It was clear that the future of movies would include sound as well as pictures. And even though he'd already begun work on his latest silent film, Blackmail, Hitchcock was more than up to the challenge of transforming it into Britain's first talkie.
There. Hooray! All ready for the academy. I'll go and get those drinks.
Right you are.
It's the tale of a blonde in peril, played by Czech star Annie Ondra, who kills her potential rapist in self-defence and is then blackmailed. She's one of Hitchcock's more complicated heroes. Innocent, yet guilty. She's killed a man, but only to save herself.
Blackmail is a very important film, a landmark film in British cinema, because it exists on this borderline between the silence and the talkies.
There's been a murder last night round the corner. And they tell me the police are on there now.
Hitchcock, who'd always been very experimental and inventive, saw this as an opportunity to take his storytelling forward in a new direction.
What's wrong, Alice? You don't look very chirpy this morning.
You do look a bit peaky on myself.
Dad, Alice, breakfast.
While other directors who made talkies, even a few years after this, really struggled with the medium of sound, made it in some ways seem like a step backwards, Hitchcock is absolutely sensitive to its possibilities from the very first moment that he starts using it.
I mean, it's one thing to buy chocolates out of ours, but it's quite another to stick a knife into a gentleman.
The fact that within the first sound film he was already experimenting with sound to trigger a subconscious reaction, I think is pretty amazing.
Knives. No, knives is not right. I must say that's what I think and that's what I feel. Whatever the provocation, I could never use a knife. Now, mind you, a knife is a difficult thing to handle. I mean, any knife. I mean, if you use a knife.
Just like the moving camera, today we take sound on film pretty much for granted, even though providing sound effects has become a massive industry in its own right. But back in 1929, everything you wanted on a picture had to be recorded at the same time. So, for example, if you wanted a couple talking in the background while an orchestra played, you had to capture it for real.
Frank, you can't do this.
Well, the main problem concerned the fact that I had a Czech film star playing the part of an English girl. I had a young actress, Joan Barry, sitting on the side with her own microphone, while Miss Andra, on the set, playing her scene, just mouthed her words. So the girl on the side had to follow her very closely.
This was a brilliant achievement, and Annie Andra's sound test gave us the first glimpse of Hitch, the director, at work.
You asked me to let you hear your voice on the talking picture.
But Hitch, you mustn't do that.
Why not?
Well, because I can speak well.
Do you realize the squad van will be here any moment?
No, really. Oh, my God, I'm terribly frightened.
Why? Have you been a bad woman or something?
Well, not just bad, but...
But you slept with men?
Oh, no!
You have not. Come here. Stand in your place. Otherwise, it will not come out right, as the girl said to the soldier. That's enough.
Pretty saucy stuff for the time, but it didn't appear to get him into any trouble. What it does reveal is a man with a wicked and eccentric wit.
Hitchcock was so notorious for playing practical jokes in the studios that when he was at Gainsborough, he was sort of disciplined for it. He was hauled up and told, you know, really this wasn't the sort of thing that a director should be doing. His fellow director, Val Guest, said that Hitchcock once asked him to lend him a tenner, which he did, and he paid him back in brass farthings, which was over 9,500 coins that a page boy from the studio dragged into his dressing room.
It's fair to say when people think of Hitchcock, they think of this master of suspense, quite rightly. They think of some of the more visceral moments of his later movies. But when you watch his early films, I'm struck, and I don't know if you are as well, I'm struck by the amount of comedy that's in it.
I think he was of the mind that you needed these moments of humour to lighten things in between the more suspenseful sequences, but they're not really the things I... You know, if there's a reel of just all of them in a row, I probably would not be sitting down to watch them.
I think Hitchcock's macabre sense of humour is something that's absolutely British. I think it's a vein that runs thickly through British culture, that juxtaposition of murder and comedy.
Strangle. Nice work. Neat, very neat. Someone very much did not want we should speak to him. That's what it looks like, doesn't it?
I think it's something he absorbed from the pages of tabloid newspapers of the day. That kind of lurid, lip-smacking interest. That's something that Hitchcock really imports into cinema.
One of my favourite sequences in any Hitchcock movie is also, in fact, my favourite sequence probably from any thriller film, and he obviously liked it a lot as well because he went back and remade the film and did it twice. It's The Man Who Knew Too Much.
The Man Who Knew Too Much is the story of a couple whose daughter is kidnapped to stop them revealing a murder plot. They learn that an assassination will take place at the precise moment the cymbals clash during a concert at the Royal Albert Hall.
That's where one of the tensest climactic sequences in modern cinema takes place. And we, the audience, know what's planned, what's going to happen. The woman, the blonde woman, of course, because Hitchcock loved the blonde in his movies, she's sitting there, she knows what's going to happen, she sees it unfolding, and the tension kind of grows and grows and becomes almost too much to bear.
It went off all right. I hope so, for all our sakes.
It really was one of those sequences which I think set the bar for other thrillers and also kind of wrote the book, introduced the grammar of those kind of sequences that's influenced just about anyone else who's made a movie.
Mr. Hitchcock, why do you always make mystery films?
Life is a big mystery, isn't it? It always has been.
The 39 Steps is probably the most enduring and celebrated of the films that Hitchcock made during the 1930s. Based on a novel by one of Hitch's favourite writers, John Buchan, it contains many familiar elements. There's a murder, a wrongly accused man, plenty of suspense, a chase sequence or two, handcuffs, and of course, a blonde.
There he is.
Hitch returns with one of his favourite characters, the innocent man on the run. Accused of murder, Richard Hannay escapes to Scotland, pursued by police and a ruthless band of spies from an unnamed country.
A key characteristic of Hitchcock's films is the concept of the wrong man, man wrongly accused of murder or some other crime. You see it from the very beginning in films like The Lodger in 1926 through to North by Northwest, where Cary Grant is suspected of being a murderer. The 39 Steps, coming right in the middle of Hitchcock's career, is a quintessential film in this respect.
May I come home, monsieur?
What's the idea?
Well, I like to.
It's your funeral.
I'm struck sometimes by the kind of the modernness of some of the sequences in his movies. I mean, this is one of my favourite moments in 39 Steps.
Oh, how do you do? How do you do? We're all waiting for you. Pamela's got to meet you at the station. This way.
Handcuffed, he finds himself forced to speak on behalf of a soon-to-be local politician, I think, and wins over the whole crowd.
Where everybody gets a square deal and a sporting chance, and where people try to help and not to hinder. A world from which suspicion and cruelty and fear have been forever banished. That is the sort of world I want. Is that the sort of world you want?
So it's a very comic moment. It's a kind of unexpected moment in that film, but I think brilliantly modern. You see the kind of echoes in this even today.
And I think it's one of the scenes in the film in which he's at his best and at his most charming.
Scottish strangers.
The hardest kind of stranger.
The toughest stranger of them all.
The toughest
to cheer
stranger in the
him
business.
as he leaves, and yet still the one person we now want to see him win over is still resolutely against him.
And tell him an enormously important secret.
That'll do now.
An enormously important secret is being taken out of this country by a foreign agent. I can't do anything myself because of this fool of a detective. Has that penetrated?
Right to the funny bone. Now tell me another one.
One of the best sequences in any of his films is another sort of great Hitchcock kind of dinner scene.
Sanctify these bounteous mercies to us miserable sinners.
You see Robert Dunat's character notice that he has the paper and that he's about to be revealed, and then she notices the paper, and then they exchange looks, and then John Norrie's character looks up and then thinks something's going on between them, and maybe they're flirting. So then he goes out.
Mind, I forgot to lock the barn.
And the camera goes with him, and then you see what he sees. You know that they're talking about how's he going to get away. He thinks that they're plotting. And so in a very short period of time, you just see someone who knows exactly where to put the camera.
And I guess also that's kind of classic Hitchcock in that we, the audience, know more than all the people on screen.
That was the thing that he was so good at, just making you lean in and making you really participate in the action that's happening.
What are the 39 steps? Come on, answer up! What are the 39 steps?
The 39 Steps is an organization of spies, collecting information on behalf of the Foreign Office of...
I think he's Hitchcock was great at using a kind of comic counterpoint to everything. It's a funny scene, even at the end when it's tragic, because you just see someone go, get the dancers on, and the dancers are on in the background.
And then they hold hands.
Yeah, and he's still got the handcuffs on his hand, and it's such an incredibly complex shot, that.
It's interesting, because I think you're aware of all that because you're directing. I wasn't aware of all that. I'm just aware of it being a lovely moment. And maybe that's the real mastery there, is that there is so much going on, and yet it didn't take me out of the moment. In 1939, after 23 films as a director, Hitchcock moved with his family to Hollywood to pursue his career over there. And even though the British film industry back then was far more robust than it is today, it was clear to everyone that that's where the future of popular cinema lay.
By the late 30s, Hitchcock had slightly outgrown the British film industry, and the move to Hollywood offered him all sorts of resources and opportunities that he couldn't get in Britain. He would have wonderful studio technology, he would have access to the biggest stars, to the best literary properties.
Announcing the return of the most glamorous motion picture ever made. How do you do?
His first Hollywood movie was an instant smash.
There is mystery, love, and laughter in Rebecca, the motion picture still unsurpassed for suspenseful romance.
It won producer David Selznick the Oscar for Best Film. It was an explosive start to this latest chapter in Hitch's legendary filmmaking career. Hitchcock repaid his adoptive country with a string of classic movies: Rear Window, Psycho, To Catch a Thief, Vertigo, The Birds, and Marnie, to name just a few.
Hitch's fingerprints were all over his movies. Both tonally and thematically, the films were all his. And he was also becoming better and better known for his cameo appearances. It's as if he began to suspect that he could be as big a star as the films themselves. And accordingly, he started using his name and his presence as a marketing tool to sell the films.
How do you do? I'm Alfred Hitchcock, and I want you to know about my latest motion picture, which will be coming soon to this theatre. It is called The Birds, and for that reason we thought it would be appropriate if a bird informed you about the details. Go ahead.
When Hitchcock signed his autograph, he always used to draw a little caricature of himself, and that caricature became his trademark. It's something that we still know. He was very careful always to look the same wherever he went. That black suit, that black tie, the famous walk. Hitchcock is very aware of how marketable he is personally. His name had been used to sell his films since 1927, so the idea of Alfred Hitchcock is in everybody's heads.
In that window on the second floor, the single one in front, that's where the woman was first seen. Let's go inside.
I mean, as part of creating a brand out of his own persona and his own skill, I guess, the humour obviously played a part in that as well. I mean, people knew there would be little quirky Hitchcockian jokes in his films, just as there always were in the trailers, and just as he always spoke with great kind of wit when he discussed his movies, you know, delivering those early sound bites, you know, memorable little nuggets which were often funny and often undercut the seriousness of what he was doing on screen. Although most of the films he made for the rest of his career would be shot in Hollywood with American money, I still think of him very much as a British director. He would use British actors, he would make films based on stories by British writers, and of course they would always be essentially Hitchcockian.
The Birds and Rebecca were based on books by English writer Daphne du Maurier, and Marnie was also from an English novel by author Winston Graham. It seems that Hitchcock was happiest with source material that came from Britain.
With North by Northwest, Hitchcock was going to make the ultimate Hitchcock film, and him and his writers decided to go back to the 39 Steps as the model for this.
I'm an advertising man, not a red herring. I've got a job, a secretary, a mother, 2 ex-wives, and several bartenders dependent upon me. And I don't intend to disappoint them all by getting myself slightly killed.
Cary Grant,
becomes a secret agent against his will.
The man on the run in North by Northwest is the ghost of Robert Donat in the 39 Steps. Those interests in the psychological, in the chase, all of those things are refined and developed in the American films, but they're absolutely rooted in what he was doing in Britain in the 30s.
At the height of his Hollywood success, Hitchcock was an international brand, but Britain was never far from his thoughts. For all his gratitude to America, recognition in his home country still mattered to him.
Here we go, turn over, keep quiet, please.
In 1971, he returned to Britain for his penultimate movie.
Hitchcock was now 72, and his status as a box office wizard was somewhat in decline. His last couple of movies had been flops, so perhaps it's not surprising that he returned to his hometown, to the city where he'd enjoyed all of his earlier successes, to try and refine that magic.
163.
Frenzy is a kind of homecoming for Hitchcock, and he goes back to his sources, back to the things that terrified him as a child. Frenzy is a news of the world, sleazy murder mystery. In a way, we're back to the world of the lodger and the ripper. There's a real murderer at the heart of Frenzy, a man called Neville Heath. He was a terrible, terrible sadist, a killer. Hitchcock was strangely obsessed with him. And actually, this isn't the first murderer that Hitchcock has this sort of obsession with. There are details of real British crimes salted away in the most unusual places in Hitchcock's films.
He made Frenzy in the final decade of his life, and it gave him the opportunity to revisit the London of his youth. Lots of it was shot in Covent Garden, which was a fruit and vegetable market at the time, and he remembered this from when he was a young man and his father had been a greengrocer.
I wouldn't go so far as to claim I have an affinity with Hitchcock because he was the son of a greengrocer, and I worked briefly in a greengrocer because I also worked briefly as a delivery boy, and I worked in a newsagent's, and I worked as a milk boy, and I had all those kind of jobs that people had back then and that young people today don't because they're pampered and they've all got PlayStations and Xboxes. Not that I'm bitter, but you don't know how lucky you are. Me and Hitchcock, we had it tough. Well, he probably had it tough. I had it less tough, but I had it tougher than you.
Someone who experienced Hitch at first hand was actress Jean Marsh, one of the stars of Frenzy, and who I was lucky enough to take a little drive with.
Let me ask you about Frenzy, because, of course, it's what actually was one of the first Hitchcock films I was aware of. Because I'd seen Psycho when I was a kid, and then I remember seeing on TV that this man, this legendary figure, was returning to London to make a movie, and I didn't quite understand what it meant. What did it mean to you, to someone in the industry and contemporaries of his, when he came back to shoot again in the UK?
I thought, oh, well, that's nice. He's coming back here. Oh, I've got a part in it. Oh, that's quite nice. And then I thought, oh, wait a minute, this is special.
How was he as a director when directing you? How specific was he? What he wanted from you? How much did he give you about your character to draw upon, or how much did he just let you work it out yourself from the text?
He definitely knew exactly what he wanted, and when you didn't get what he wanted, he would wait endless takes. I said, why do you keep doing this one thing over and over again? And all I'm doing is walking to the flat. He said, it just doesn't work. You're not doing it. I said, all right, I'll just think about it. I thought, what can I do to make it work? So I wondered, I'll think that I want to rush because I want to pee. So I did that, and he said, that's fine. And he said, what did you do? I said, no, I'm not going to tell you. I'll tell you later. So I told him later, and he said, oh, I'm glad you didn't tell me.
When you were filming out with him, did it cause a stir that you were out with Hitchcock? Because one of the things that fascinates me about him was, unlike almost every other director, he was himself a star.
Oh, huge, of course. Yes, so people, it's quite infuriating. People looked at you in the street, they would go, oh, and I think, what about me? I'm Jean Marsh. Yeah, forget it. No, he was a big star.
He was a bigger star than most of the stars in his movies,
okay.
Of course.
Or there was no one like him. Even Spielberg isn't a star, and he was a star.
I think if Spielberg put on about 200 pounds, he might be a star, like Hitchcock. As it is, he's instantly... I mean, I've met him, he's a great talent, but more or less instantly forgettable. Whereas I imagine Hitchcock, I bet you carried a meeting with Hitchcock with you for quite a long while.
Well, I think he liked the two sides of himself. He enjoyed playing Hitchcock as well as being him.
Apart from Friends, of course, do you have a favourite Hitchcock movie or a favourite Hitchcock moment?
Vertigo. It was really creepy, and yet also with the same thing, suddenly little bits of flash of humour. What wonderful.
Jean, let me drive you home. Where would you like to go to?
To your place.
OK, let's do it. I think it's somewhat fitting that Frenzy was to be Hitch's last hit. He completed one more film, Family Plot, but with illness dogging his final few years, he walked away from his last movie in the planning stages. He was knighted in 1980, but died in hospital in April of the same year.
There's been a lot of stuff recently, a lot of people coming forward and telling their story of their relationship with Hitchcock. There's been a couple of movies that have just come out. One was a TV film, one was a cinema film, and I'm kind of wary of their version of the truth. I mean, obviously they knew Hitchcock. I never met Hitchcock. But when someone comes out and said he was this or he was that, and you think that's only based on your working experience with him for a short period of time, I think you have to assume that maybe they didn't see the whole man. And some people have said, oh, he saw himself as being like his leading men. Inside, he wanted to be Cary Grant, and when he looked in the mirror, he saw himself as Cary Grant. He carried himself as Cary Grant. I can't help but think that must be bullshit. I don't think he was an idiot. I don't think he was someone who was self-delusional. And I think he was also an incredibly aware commercial filmmaker.
Sir Alfred Hitchcock travelled an awfully long way from Leytonstone High Road, propelled by talents that Britain couldn't ultimately contain. And by leaving these shores, he became a legend. Hitch is buried in America, but I'm now even more convinced that Britain made him what he was and shaped his talent to scare the world. Something that he never forgot.
Hitchcock is one of the most important figures in all of cinema. He's one of the greatest directors who ever lived.
There are very few directors who you can just use their name and it immediately conjures up an image of what their films are all about.
I think he's an incredibly emotional filmmaker and just really got into the guts of things so brilliantly.
He's a director who speaks to things inside us that are very dark, that are very strange, and that we don't really like to talk about.
And how do we Brits pay tribute to the life and career of our greatest director? Well, we knocked down the house he was born in and we put a plaque on the side of a garage. I'm joking, of course, because his great British brilliance needs no other tribute than the body of work he left behind.
If you could only make one more picture, what would it be about?
I think it would be about murder, mayhem, violence, sex, and a joke or two.
The drama everyone's talking about reaches its finale. Will there be closure for Broadchurch? Find out tomorrow night at 9 here on ITV.